Welcome to the sixth in the Pillars of Democracy series, sponsored by the Library of Congress in partnership with the American Enterprise Institute and the Brookings Institution. I'm John Haskell, director of the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. We live in a challenging time. Polls show that major institutions in American society, in government and in civic life, are less trusted and less respected than at any time in recent memory. In an effort to grapple with the question of how their decline can be counteracted, we are bringing together historians, political scientists, legal scholars, authors, and practitioners from across the ideological spectrum. The idea is to create a fuller picture of the challenges facing American institutions and their potential promise. Last month, we looked at political parties. Today, we consider a crucial part of the political process that is now front page news seemingly almost every day: electoral institutions, from the voting itself to post-election administration. We're at the point now where partisans on both sides believe the system is fundamentally flawed, but there's little agreement on what the problems are, even as reformers seek comprehensive change. Our panelists today include Julia Azari, associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Marquette University, and a former distinguished visiting scholar at the Kluge Center at the library. One of the leading experts on elections, she is the author of Delivering the People's Message: The Changing Politics of the Presidential Mandate. You can see her writings on 538 and in numerous other outlets. John C. Fortier is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on election administration and other issues, including the Electoral College. He's the author and editor of After the People, a guide to the Electoral College, and Absentee and Early Voting: Trends, Promises, and Perils. Elaine Kamarck is a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program, as well as the director of the Center for Effective Public Management at the Brookings Institution. She's an expert on American electoral politics and government innovation. She's the author of Primary Politics: Everything You Need to Know About How America Nominates Its Presidential Candidates, and Why Presidents Fail and How They Can Succeed Again. Our moderator today is Yuval Levin, the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, the founder and editor of National Affairs. He's also a senior editor at the New Atlantis, a contributing editor at National Review, and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. Please note that we're leaving time for questions at the end of the conversation, about 45 or 50 minutes from now. But starting now, you can submit your questions through the chat function on Zoom, and we encourage you to do so. Thank you for tuning in. Let me turn this over to Yuval Levin. Yuval?
Our format is going to be conversational and straightforward. I'm going to start off with a few questions, but this is going to go where our three panelists take it. We are, as John mentioned, leaving some time for your questions at the end of the conversation. We're taking up a subject that is hotly contested literally right now, this minute in Washington, because of continuing controversies around the 2020 election, because of legislation that's been moving at the state level and at the federal level. This question of the condition, the state of our institutions of election administration is very pertinent, very important, and very hotly debated. Our goal here is not to add to the heat of those debates, but rather to shed some light on them, to help to have them be better understood, with help from scholars who think about these questions in practical terms and in philosophical terms. And we have really the perfect panel to do that here. And so let's just jump straight in. Maybe the way to start, especially because we want to shed some light on this to begin with, is to set the scene just a little bit. Before we jump into problems and disputes about the election system, maybe we can help our audience get a sense of just what that system actually consists of, its parts, its levels, who's in charge of what. I'll ask each of the three of you to reflect on that a little bit and point to what maybe most stands out to you about the nature of the system. But John Fortier, maybe I can begin with you and just offer us a broad sense. How would you describe America's system of election administration to someone who knows little or nothing about it to begin with?
Thanks, Yuval, and thanks to the library for having us here. I think that everybody knows the simple way of describing American elections, that they are decentralized, and that word contains a lot within it. We run elections at different levels, and we have many actors involved. Just to go back to sort of constitutional matters, which is not all that matters here, because I think history and practice is also important. And the Constitution, you have a division of labor, but it's for Congress, I think, is more clear. Congressional elections, the Constitution basically says that the states shall make laws regarding elections, but that the federal government, the Congress, by law, could alter or make their own ones to overrule them. And we have that distinction. We have a lot done at the state level, but we also have people at we have laws at the federal level. Not so many, but some very important laws at various times that have been put in place to overrule those laws. At the presidential election follows something of that pattern, but the Constitution actually is a little less clear about that, or at least it doesn't seem to give as much power to the federal government. It really talks about the federal government being able to talk about the time of having the election, not all the changes in manner. Courts have broadly interpreted federal laws applying to presidential elections as well, but I think that issue becomes very complicated and became complicated in some of the discussions of the last election, because there's an important role for state legislatures. And how strong that role is subject to debate. Certainly state legislatures could even not have elections and elect presidential electors to the Electoral College directly, but they also may have a role in fashioning the law and then ultimately maybe in overseeing that law. And the court is playing with some things. So I think it's a little less clear, but certainly there are federal powers and state powers. Again, I won't go through the whole history, but there are a few areas where Congress has stepped in: voting rights, voter registration. After the 2000 election, a big compromise bill to fix a number of things, including technology and voting registration, overseas voting. There have been moments where Congress has come together and usually been in a broad-based way, partly because of the filibuster, but just agreement between the parties about some big things that have been passed at the federal level. But most of what we see goes on at the state level. Most state law applies to most of the controversies we're talking about today. Local administration is extremely important within that context, and the state-local relationship is also important. But I think that's also important to be said. I won't go through all the changes that have happened in election administration very recently, but a few to note. Since the 2000 election, we made some big changes. We had the first time federal money was ever sent to the states to run elections, or to help run elections, to buy technology essentially. But we've improved our voter registration systems. They were, I think, much more decentralized before. We've also done a lot more voting by mail and early voting in person. That's not because of that law in 2000 or after the 2000 election, but it's just a trend that we've seen come really starting in the late 70s and then accelerated in the last election with COVID. Two more points. The COVID situation and the last election really did cause a number of controversies, and some of those were because of the different levels of government and the different actors involved. So when a primary election came up, who would make the decision to make some last minute changes? Would it be the legislature by law, the governor, the secretary of state, maybe even a health official, state courts, federal courts? Does Congress have a role coming in? Does the federal courts protect the state legislature? Those were all questions that we wrestled with and to some extent wrestled with in the general election as well. The two areas, I think, just broadly speaking, we're talking about today are changes, sort of broad changes in the way we run elections that a set of bills that Democrats have proposed would overrule state law in certain areas, set certain minimum standards everywhere. And then also potentially changes in the way we count the electoral vote. There's a law many know now called the Electoral Count Act, passed back in the 19th century after our most troublesome election, the 1876 election. And it deals with all these mechanisms of the way electors are appointed by states, the way Congress on January 6th is to count or be there while they're being counted, and then ultimately how we're going to transfer that election in November to having a president that would take office on January 20th. And I'm sure we'll get into the controversies about that, but I think those are two important areas that we're talking about with the reform today, which involve all of those same many actors that were described in the earlier section.
Elaine, I wonder what you'd add to that. You're often especially good at thinking about the practicalities of public administration, what things look like to the people who actually have to do something on the ground. How do you think about our election administration system from that point of view?
Well, let me start by going back a little bit in history, because there's a curious phenomenon here, right? A little bit of a paradox. After 2016, the discussion around election administration was all about fear of hacking by foreign powers, especially the Russians. So if you were in those discussions after 2016, and Congress actually passed some laws to it, as John referred to, there was a lot of federal money that went to states to harden their computer systems against hacking. So, and one of the things that came out of that was that, well, you know what, the best protection for our election system in the internet age is that old-fashioned thing called paper. Okay. And in fact, a lot of discussions were about instituting paper ballots so that you would have a set of ballots that you could actually go through and count the old-fashioned way in the event the systems were hacked by the other party, by the Russians, by the Chinese, by criminals, who knows. So then we come to the 2020 presidential election, and we find that we're holding it in the middle of a pandemic. And all of a sudden, the trend that John referred to for absentee voting goes into hyperdrive, right? All of a sudden, people are saying, oh yeah, I'm going to absentee vote. I'm not going to that school auditorium and stand in there for 35 minutes and get COVID. No way. So two things that had been trending in one direction take off. One is the ballot boxes, where you could early vote. One is early voting, and the other is absentee ballots. And as John referred to, there's quite a mishmash of authorities here, right? Sometimes the states were doing this, sometimes the courts were doing this, sometimes the Secretary of State would sort of do it with the tacit acquiescence of the legislature. And there's a mishmash. In the middle of that comes, of course, Donald Trump, who sees an opportunity to start saying that the system is corrupt and that this whole absentee ballot thing especially is corrupt. Now, this was clearly Trumpian. I study mostly presidential primaries, so not many people remember this, but I do. During the Republican presidential primary, even as he was winning delegates, he was constantly talking about how corrupt the system was and how they were cheating him out of delegates, and he wanted a recount and all this stuff. So this was, par for the course for Donald Trump. And the rapid rate of change in 2020 allowed, I believe, Trump to establish a grain of suspicion in a lot of people's minds, which we are still living with today. So that brings us to the question of why we're here, right? And of course, why we're here talking about this is that, as the Brennan Center says, there were 440 bills introduced during the last year to basically suppress the vote in some way or another. But that's the headline, and that's the headline that's often used. Overlooked is the fact that there were only 34 passed in 19 states. So this isn't it isn't a horrible disaster, but it's a looming disaster, okay? And the action in those states was very much in swing states, and it was very much in counties that were primarily African-American or minority and Democratic. That's where all the attention was. And so that's where election reform is today. The second challenging thing is not just voter suppression. The second challenging thing is what I call the new aspect to this. And the new aspect to this are all the laws that are now being introduced that insert some form of partisan power over traditional election administrations. That we have not seen before. Voter suppression we have seen. And actually the two political parties, I mean, I don't want to understate it too much, but frankly, the Dems and the Republicans, they know this game. All right, they know how to play this game. I can't remember the figure from 2020, but each national party had like thousands of lawyers ready to go and challenge things. I mean, that they know. This is new and different and scarier, because this goes not just to suppressing the vote, this goes to possibly overturning a vote that was achieved legally. And that, I think, is something new and incredibly scary in our democracy. We're seeing all of these efforts play out in a handful of states that are swing states, surprise, surprise, or that are states that I call states that are really purple states. And several of these states, and this will be my last point, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin particularly, the trends, oh, and Georgia as well, sorry, 4 of them, the trends in the electorate are Democratic. And yet the administration and the legislatures are still Republican. So we have a situation where you have a Republican, essentially Republicans in control, because they've been in control for so long, of a lot of the important legal authorities in the state, and yet the electorate is changing. Georgia doubled its African American population in the last decade. Okay, so there's been an enormous change and of course in Arizona you have a Hispanic population, et cetera. So this effort to kind of undermine or put partisans in control of elections, endless recounts, letting non-election officials get involved with election machinery, et cetera, is really a new thing in this whole area of electoral administration, and a quite frightening one. And so with that, I'll turn it over back to you, Yuval.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Julia, I'd love to have you jump in here, and maybe especially as a scholar of the parties, on that last point about the role of partisan politics at the center of our system, which I would say to a lot of international observers of the American system is one of the more peculiar. That and the decentralization of it are the more peculiar features of that system. How do you think about American election administration as a whole, to begin with?
So I want to speak to the contours of the politics surrounding this. And I think there are sort of 3 interrelated ideas that I think about when I think about these things. The first one, I'll start with your partisan question. And I want to start and kind of pick up on some of the things that John and Elaine have mentioned, and also maybe put in the context of the voting rights bill that failed in the Senate last night. So the question, I think this is more in true panel fashion, this is more of a question than a comment maybe, is whether there really is a deep philosophical difference between Republicans and Democrats in terms of how they think about voting rights, about which level of government should be in charge of them, about kind of, should we default to very expansive voting rights or to election security. I think a lot of these questions predate the Trump years. Certainly here, I'm coming to you from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where we've had the voter ID fight for a good decade before it was cool in the rest of the country. So I think that's really a live question about this sort of the philosophical underpinnings and what each side of the partisan debate brings to that particular question when we're thinking about the voting rights piece of this larger set of issues. So that's one way to think about it. The other question that I have, the thing that I think about is 2 sort of tensions in the way that our elections work and the way that our politics work, if that makes any sense. The first, and I think maybe the deeper and the one that sort of alludes to what Elaine was talking about with election administration at states and the possibility of overturn, is that we have a strong, and at this point, very long-standing, deep into the 19th century sort of norm that the presidential election should reflect some semblance of the popular vote, and that electors are primarily chosen by the people. But our institutions have never actually formally caught up to that reality. It's still possible for the states to make different rules. It's still technically legal for the states to make different rules about the allocation of electors. And if we look at the way that the Electoral College works and the way that the Electoral Count Act works, that tension there is still very much live. And I think not only produces the possibility of election results being overturned in the states and of slates of electors being potentially contested in the states. But the other side of that coin is for that to be deeply delegitimized, because that's simply not how people think about how elections are supposed to work. And I think there's a sort of whole round tension there, multifaceted tension there. The other one, I just want to speak to the decentralization question very briefly, because I think you mentioned, Yuval, that international observers find the decentralization of our elections puzzling. I think Americans do too. And it was really striking to me. I was teaching a course here at Marquette in the fall of 2020. This is an upper division elections course with some very sophisticated political science majors, people who've interned on the Hill, taken a lot of political science courses. And they were surprised at the extent to which our elections were decentralized. We are now, the people who are aging into the electorate in particular, are living in a world in which they expect to live their lives in many ways across state lines. And we have a very nationalized political conversation, very nationalized political parties. And for the administration to be so decentralized not only creates all these kinds of technical questions and challenges, but also in a way poses a political challenge, and it reveals a system where the technical rules are really out of sync with the kind of broader political reality that people live in. The final thing, I'll just kind of get to the partisan elephant in the room, which is that I think there is a kind of broad sense, right or wrong, that either political party, but maybe particularly the Republican Party with Trump still as this kind of major figure, is intent on delegitimizing the whole idea of opposition and elections, and will use and be willing to exploit any kind of loophole in the system, of which there are many, right? Any kind of ambiguity in the system, any kind of point of contention between state and federal, or between different institutions, in order to subvert an election. I'm not saying that is necessarily true, or I subscribe to that viewpoint, but I think it's very widely held. And that's really the essence of having this conversation, is that for a long time we stumbled on and on with this patchwork electoral system, but now there's this kind of sense that there is the political will and willingness to exploit the formal institutions in order to breach those norms.
Thank you. Three tremendously helpful comments that really lay out a lot of what we'll want to discuss in the remainder of the conversation. I wonder if one place to pick up, maybe I'll ask you, Elaine, is on this question of decentralization. Is the intense decentralization of our elections just a fact we have to live with, or is it a good thing? Does it have, is it a strength ultimately? Is it something we should be proud of? Or is it something that, to the extent we can, we need to be doing away with so that we can have a more rational system? How do you think about it?
Well, it's interesting because given my opening comments about 2016 and 2020, right? One of the things that when we came out of 2016, we were happy about was the fact that, because this system was so decentralized, it was really hard for one hacker to really screw up the whole election. So the Russians, the Chinese, whoever the bad guys were, right, would have to master lots and lots and lots of different systems. And so the very decentralization was a kind of protection against hacking, which was the issue then. We get to 2020, right? And we find that the decentralization has all sorts of problems because all the states are doing it differently. There's no real consensus on this. And what happens is that particularly in the absentee voting, it goes from being a rather small portion of the electorate to an enormous portion of the electorate. Nobody's really ready to handle it. It took a long time to count ballots, longer than we were accustomed to, et cetera. States did start to learn from each other, as they always do. It remains one of the beauties of federalism, which is when you're faced with something like a pandemic, the states learn from each other. But the fact of the matter was that everybody, I think, could have used some clearer guidance in 2020. So the decentralization argument, I mean, there's two sides to it.
John, how do you think about that question? Ideally, should we want a more centralized election system?
Yeah, this is a good set of questions. I agree with Elaine that there's, one can find some virtue on both sides. I will say, first of all, it is actually baked much more deeply into our system than I think most people realize, even though I agree with Julia's point that most people don't think about it that way. There are, for example, you have not only all the differences between states, but you don't really have the federal government running the election. I think that's something people forget. As much as we might make laws at the federal level, we don't have administration. We don't have an election commission. And so federal law applies kind of episodically through courts here and there. It influences things very indirectly. The type of change we would need to be a national system would be tremendous. I mean, mostly it would mean consolidating the running of elections at the federal level. On the other side of this, I think we see in the debate over some of the more the democratic reforms in the Senate recently and in the House earlier, that we've had the filibuster in place, and that's a separate issue. But in some ways, that has kept our politics, meaning the federal law that we pass, has to be somewhat more consensual. And one virtue of that is we do allow different things in the states, and if we didn't, if we had one system, that system would change dramatically as one party came in place in another. So today, rules applying certain standards for absentee voting. Tomorrow, nationwide voter ID. The changes back and forth, and there is a way in which states still do jealously guard their ability to run the elections the way they see fit. Of course, some of them are partisan politics. Red states do one thing, blue states do another, but some of them have to do with rural states or state histories or ways in which they think they can run elections. That would all go away. So I think there's some protection, as Elaine said. There's some way in which there's more consent, so the people closer to the way you vote in states will be that way. But it is an extremely decentralized system, and so I think we have moved to be a little less decentralized over time. We have fewer cities and towns and counties, and we have more control at the state level of the locals than I think we did 20, 30 years ago. And probably some more standardization might be helpful, but I think going all the way would be hard to do with our system, and also would have some downsides in terms of the accountability, the way things switch, and the way that some states really do see some value in being able to run elections within certain parameters the way they see fit for their state.
Julia, how do you think about that question?
So I certainly am sympathetic to everything that's been said about the enormity of the administrative task of trying to do elections at a national level. I want to just add a couple of things that I think, again, sort of add a political dimension to this question. The first one is that I think with all the advantages of having some of the administration at the local level, that administration is not purely a kind of neutral thing, that election administration is very closely tied up in these questions about voting rights. And in the United States, those questions have been closely tied up with race at different points, with gender, with other types of kind of social struggles that we've faced, and that are points of nationalization in the election process, if we conceive of administration very broadly, have been things like the Voting Rights Act. And we could even go into the 19th Amendment and the Civil Rights, the Civil War, post-Civil War amendments. So I think that's useful to think about as well. Sort of, what parts has the federal government been effective at handling at different points in time? And also the flip side of that, what parts has the federal government been ineffective at handling? The other thing that I think about is that, again, I believe lurking beneath the surface here is really the phenomenon of polarized and nationalized politics. And that one of the advantages of the kind of modern election administration system at the local level has been that it has been professionalized and bureaucratized in a way that has been separate from national electoral politics. And I think both panelists have alluded to this before already, which is that we're seeing a shift in that in the post-Trump, specifically in the post-Trump Republican Party, and it certainly could also be the case that there will be reaction of a similar sort among Democrats. And And so I think one way to think about it is not so much just about the level of government, but about the way things are either professionalized, bureaucratized, and taken out of partisan politics, or alternately are infused with nationalized partisan politics. And that's really, I think, how I conceptualize that question.
Let me follow up on one thing, Julia, the very important point about polarization. How much of the worry about elections that we're going through now is a function of just being in a period of extremely close elections for a very long time? We've now had really a quarter century where at the national level, not only at the presidential level, though especially there, we've just had really unusually close elections. Are these questions an issue anytime, or are they particularly an issue when there's just not a durable majority party in the country?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think in terms of thinking about that historically, that has, the ones that jump out are certainly, that's the case, right? John already mentioned the 1876 election, and then the Electoral Count Act, I believe, was done in anticipation of the closeness of the 1888 election, in correct anticipation of that. And then, thinking back to more recent national elections where we've actually talked about these sorts of issues, 1960 and obviously 2000. So I think that's the case, the closeness of the election. But I do also think that the sort of competition and the competition over the control over the institutions and over the reins of power. We have a lot of discussions, as John Haskell alluded to, introducing this whole series, right? We're at a sort of kind of epic moment of distrust of institutions, and everybody thinks that someone else, I think, is controlling the institutions. I think that element of partisan politics is also informing this, in addition to the closeness, is kind of genuine senses of vulnerability and also maybe genuine philosophical differences.
Could I jump in just on the question
Please.
of the politics, especially at the local level? Because I think I agree with a lot of what Elaine and Julia said, but I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. So there is this belief that somehow that we have sort of nonpartisan election administration at a local level. That actually, I think, is not as true as many people would say. I mean, I think we have a long history of having elected officials, either partisan or sort of bipartisan aspects to them. The results of an election determine who's in charge of something. Give examples that many places the local election officials are directly elected. In some places, they follow the winner of the state election, the governor's election. Every local board in Virginia, for example, in Ohio, will change hands in terms of who's in charge based on who the governor is. We have a history of kind of bipartisan watchers over things. Now that's a different system than many of our other world democracies where there's more of a civil administration of things. I do agree with Elaine that there's been this move to talk about maybe using some of those powers to not certify elections or to kind of overturn them and to go against the will of the people. But I think that's many of the laws I think that are being put in place are not directly doing that, although I think that's a very bad thing in rhetoric as well. But I think a lot of it is that we have this history of control of the elections by the political system, and that we have political actors. And so I don't think we should portray this as now politics is coming in at the local level. I think the national politics is different in some ways than maybe the local elected officials and that before, and there are other actors kind of coming in from afar. But I don't think that we should say that this realm of elections has been free of politics. In fact, just the opposite. We tend to be much more having political figures involved in it than other countries.
Elaine, how do you think about that question, the relation between our polarized moment and the kind of political tenor of running elections?
Well, I think that I have to go to the pandemic to answer that question, right? If you had said to me, or probably to any of us on this panel 10 years ago, you're having a major pandemic and people's response to it is going to be according to their political party, we would have said, what? That's crazy, right? That's nuts. We used to teach it at the Kennedy School. We used to teach we had a whole spring exercise on a pandemic, and the issue of partisan politics never once in all the students who participated in this came into play. And so what we're living in is a time where everything gets politicized, including whether or not you should get a vaccine, whether or not you should wear a mask, things that I don't think any of us anticipated. So while I take John's point, I think that that we're seeing school boards around the country turning into, big fights over the culture wars that frankly the schools have nothing to do with. So the governor here in Virginia just said the other day in his inaugural address that he was going to ban critical race theory from the classroom. Well, that's good. It was never in the classroom. So that was pretty easy to ban it from the classroom. So we're living in a sort of crazy time. And I think that that's one of the things we're seeing with all this attention paid to election officials and trying attempts in some states, Arizona, particularly Michigan, attempts to get election officials to quit their jobs and get people in there who are friendly, mostly to Donald Trump. This is a very grassroots, it's very, very local. And I'm critical of my own party, the Democratic Party, for focusing so heavily on federal legislation. Because this battle is going to be fought just like school board to school board. This battle is going to be fought county election administrator to county election administrator. And I think the Democrats have been surprised by it. I think their focus on Washington has been completely backwards. I mean, it's not that I wouldn't like to see these laws passed, but they were never going to be passed. Come on. I mean, this was just a dream that Democrats have to wake up from.
Maybe we can use that as a jumping off point to some of the concerns that are most alive now in the contentious debates around these questions. You've all in one way or another already pointed to some of these worries, but a broad concern expressed yesterday by the president in a very clear, straightforward way that if some of these laws that are being advanced by Republican legislators in the states are enacted, there would be reasons to question the legitimacy of the election, even though the midterm election. That's how he was asked the question, in fairness, so he answered it that way. But maybe particularly about the next presidential election too, that some of these laws really create a situation that would make for good reasons to worry about the legitimacy of our system. I wonder if you each might, I'll start with you, John, might just speak to that broad question. Are you worried about the legitimacy of the system? And are you worried as a result of something we've seen, something that seems to be happening in the states or in Washington? Are you alarmed as a scholar of this system about where it's headed?
Well, I'm alarmed by some things and not as much by others. So I think I am alarmed by not only the rhetoric, but I think sometimes the efforts of parties, institutions, individuals to seek to delegitimize elections. And that you could mean a lot of things by that, but it can mean things that are done in the counting of the electoral votes, not conceding elections, wanting to sort of contest elections beyond what the legal date is. There are things that I think that is troubling. I wouldn't say that it's completely unprecedented, but it's certainly something that we do not want to see, and that ultimately having a system that both parties can at some point stop and say, we lost this one, we didn't agree with everything, but it's time to move on. I think that is troubling. What I don't think is as troubling is the difference between the parties as to what types of election administration they're pushing. And I think sometimes both parties raise this to a fever pitch that the all will be lost if voter ID isn't passed, if we don't have national standards for a number of days for voting by mail. Those may be good things, and I'm fine for the parties to have these debates. I think, like Elaine, most of those will probably happen in the states, and we'll end up with different, blue versions of these sets of institutions and red versions. But just in terms of the turnout that sometimes people promise from reforms, or the turnout that turnout depression that people worry about other reforms, voter ID, for example, most of the research out there doesn't show that these things have massive turnout effects. And so I think we're arguing about honest differences in these areas, but I think we're not really being honest about how severe the living in a blue state and running under their laws versus living in a red state is unlikely to return us to long ago where things really were bad. and where turnout was much lower and where there was much more legal discrimination. So I think that these types of things are a little more debates we can have, and maybe we need to tone down the rhetoric about what the effects of them are. But I don't think those types of things are really getting at the legitimacy of elections in the way that the first set of things were.
Julia, what worries you on the legitimacy question?
Everything. So I think the way I think about this, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how elections are interpreted and this question of legitimacy and the kind of development of legitimate opposition in US politics. And here is how I think I would conceptualize my thinking on this. I'm not worried about the integrity of American elections. And that includes some of the concerns that emerge on the right about people who shouldn't be voting, and also some of the concerns on the left about mass disenfranchisement. I agree with John. I don't think either of those is really going to meaningfully alter the quality of elections in such a way that it would really damage them. The way I think instead about that second scenario, people having their right to vote infringed on in some way, I think about that in a much different way. I think we should think about that as a civil rights issue, not as a sort of collective, this will sway the election issue. And I think I'm somewhat in agreement with some of the things Elaine has said, critical of the Democratic Party in terms of the way these issues have been framed. A civil rights violation, if someone is the victim of a civil rights violation of discrimination in a place of public accommodation, we don't talk about that as this was a collective harm to everyone. This fundamentally undermined the country. We think about it as this was a person's right as a human being and their right under the Constitution, and it's been abridged. And so I think it is actually a more useful framework to think about voting rights in an individual way, even though that may not seem as impactful in the way that some of these discussions are framed. That's how I want to think about it. I think that threat is very real. The other way I think about it, I think a lot about the kinds of rejoinders we've heard this year to Republican response to 2020 with, Democrats contested 2004 and there was a sort of rumbling about the votes in Ohio. There was certainly a lot of protest activity upon the inauguration of Donald Trump and some questions about the election, but a lot of it was about the substance. And I think the way that these things have merged together is what's alarming right now. Is there's always sort of been this talk about, there was this election, when it's close, it's harder to accept, I think, that your side lost. And so there's this sort of rumbling about, this election was illegitimate. That really is really code for, we don't think these ideas are legitimate. And those two things have really been raised to kind of a fever pitch in contemporary politics and been brought into the institutional realm. I think this has always been a feature of two-party politics in the United States, is some level of contestation of, that other party, their ideas are bad and they're dangerous and they're unconstitutional. That's honestly pretty standard. But merging it with this notion of truly illegitimate, truly institutionally illegitimate, I think is what's new. And it's those things together becoming more literal that's the threat.
Elaine, please.
Yeah, I would add one dimension to this, that I think that, yes, on the macro level, a lot of these voting laws that we get very upset about, don't make much of a difference one way or the other. But we are in an era of extremely close elections. And when you look at the changes that are attempted in many states, you go back to the old civil rights question about disparate impact. And so let me give you an example from Michigan that I just read about today, which is the legislature passed a law about what people who didn't have an ID could do to vote, right? And it used to be that they just signed an affidavit to vote. And the law would make that vastly more complicated, okay? Now, again, in the last election, and I wrote this down just for this session, there were 2.3 million votes cast in Michigan, and 11,417, or half of 1%, were cast by people who didn't have the proper ID. However, almost all of their votes were in majority Black counties. This was it. So again, that's where this gets complicated, right? Is when it looks like you are targeting a specific vote. If the African American vote was a 50-50 vote, nobody would bother to target it in the first place, right? And these sorts of things wouldn't make any difference, but it's not a 50-50 vote. So a lot of this stuff is geared towards the African American community because it's a 90% plus Democratic vote or an 88% plus Democratic vote presidentially. And therefore, it is a way to influence an election outcome, because our elections are all so very close. And that's where it gets complicated, because then we have a civil rights issue as well as a fairness issue. And are you trying to tilt the table on the election issue?
We're going to turn soon to audience questions, and I can remind people that if you have a question, you can send it along to us in the chat. But before we do that, among people who have either raised concerns with the bills proposed by Democrats in Washington or just thought that they weren't going anywhere, the alternative that everybody jumps to is, let's think about Electoral Count Act reform instead.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like maybe there are some Republicans who are open to that too, so it might actually be plausible. Help us understand what that's all about. John, you literally wrote the book about this, so maybe I'll start with you. But
Start with John.
what's the Electoral Count Act briefly, and especially what about it might need changing or might do with reform?
Yeah, I think you're right, Yuval. We're talking about maybe that's the next set of reforms that there might be some agreement on. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, and I think it's complicated, and probably a modest change might even be a good thing, and instead of trying to fix everything. But that being said, as we've talked about, this was an act passed in 1887 in response or after the 1876 election, trying to deal with some of the problems there. To simplify that election, there were some key states where there were almost two different governments, but two different sets of people appointing presidential electors. And that led to Congress, not on January 6th then, but a different day, but the counting, being there for the counting of the votes and being faced with which is the right set of electors, this state's electors or this other one. And of course, that case, we had a division between the parties with one party in charge of each branch of the Congress. And so it went all the way up to the inauguration, almost didn't get resolved, and finally we did resolve it. But it was really a very messy situation, and it shows that some of the machinery after the people vote, as my book is called, when all these actors act, is very complicated. I guess I would say a few things. One, there's this question of what is the role of states? And I think broadly, and I think there's some caveats to this, but broadly speaking, states are running these elections and they're coming to some conclusion about who won the election. And then they are appointing these people, these presidential electors. They meet in December. Congress shows up. The vice president's there too. I don't think he's as important as some people would say, but the Congress is there on January 6th for the counting of the vote. And has to decide what to do. Mostly they should do nothing, right? Mostly it's pretty obvious. You get one set of electors, it says who won, you count them, and we have a president. In fact, really this question of two sets of electors hasn't come up since 1876 when we passed this law afterwards to deal with it. What types of things might we do to deal with some issues? One, I think it is relatively easy for Congress to make objections to slates of electors. It really only requires one member of the House, one member of the Senate for Congress to divide into two, it's natural bodies and to debate this. And arguably it encourages more objection and more debate and raising that threshold. I think that seems like an easy one for people to deal with. I think a more difficult would be somehow really saying that the states are running these elections and that they end and they appoint electors, and there really isn't that much to talk about. But I think that can get a little complicated too, because the people worry about state legislatures. Maybe they come back in. And then I think the role of the vice president became very important or was in the news, certainly, with Donald Trump encouraging Vice President Pence to play this role, which I think is not in the Constitution, really not warranted, and he did not play that role. I don't know that the law, doesn't. I don't think the law gives the Vice President a lot of power, but maybe clarifying that he doesn't have that power. Just dealing with some of these issues, and I think the biggest one may be the objections, just making it harder for people to object to what should probably go through as a more regular process is the big one. If you really get into these very, very complicated questions of what if we had two slates of electors, that's where the act gets really complicated, where it's hard to explain what the answer is and why it might be somewhat arbitrary. And while I think we could go down that route, I think there are some problems with how one might. I don't think we're ever going to get a completely satisfactory answer by reforming all of those details, even though people would like to have some certainty.
Elaine, do you think there's much to be gained by having the Electoral Count be the next phase of these debates?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I mean, the big problem in American politics today is the Electoral College and the two senators from every state. I mean, we're in a very different world than we were when the country was constantly expanding and new states were being added in, and the country wasn't so lopsided in its population centers. So the Electoral College is a huge problem, but I go back to Julia's point, which is, this is an institution that is lagging behind the reality. But basically America thinks it should just be the most votes. Forget the Electoral College. Now, we all know we can't just forget it because it's in the Constitution and it's not going anyplace. But we've got a huge problem with the Electoral College. This could be a great first step, at least, removing some of the ambiguity, some of the pressure that was on Pence. This could be a great first step. But I'm really hopeful that states will begin to take seriously things like the national vote, where the states would decide to give their Electoral College votes to the winner of the national election, because this is crazy. I mean, we really do have minority rule in America right now, particularly in the United States Senate. There are senators who represent a fraction of senators in Delaware and Wyoming, just to be bipartisan about it, who represent a fraction of the number of people in California and Texas. This is nuts. The founding fathers didn't see this happening. And so I really do think we need to think seriously and keep our eye on the Electoral College.
Julia, on this point?
Yeah, I think so. I've been sort of thinking about the role of the Electoral College. I'm someone who's really flipped from being basically fine with the Electoral College to being really frustrated with, as Elaine pointed out, this capacity for minority rule. I think that the advantage of the Electoral College has been kind of in between, say, I don't know, 1888 and 2000 and 2004, has been that it actually has a sort of way of being decisive about a fairly close election. And I think that we kind of saw that in action in 2020. That may be breaking down. That role for the Electoral College may be breaking down. It's not a role to which it was particularly ascribed. I think it's just something that's evolved. If, the Electoral Count Act, and I also agree with John that there are things about it that can be improved, that making it more difficult for members of Congress to object to the slates of electors sent by the states would make a lot of sense. There are a number of ambiguities that would make a lot of sense, but also that if we have a situation in which states are actually sending multiple slates of electors and that it's truly contested, I don't know what the solution is that would actually have broad popular legitimacy at that point. And there, I think that the 1876 example is really instructive. Which is that they had, in that situation, created this supposedly supposed to be bipartisan commission. It didn't work out that way, to circumvent the constitutional remedy, which is that it goes to the House. That's what the Constitution says should happen if the Electoral College can't decide. And I think at various points in history, for various reasons, no one's been happy with that. And it illustrates this larger problem, which is that if the election is truly contested, there's not really a great way to resolve that.
We'll bring forward a couple of related questions from our viewers here. Several of them have to do with this scenario where a state legislature decides to override the results of a popular vote in the presidential election. A prospect that's been raised by some state legislatures, in some ways even was in 2020 raised by some state legislatures, and which now is raised by a lot of people concerned about some of the laws being advanced in the states. Maybe I'll start with you, John. Is that prospect plausible? Is that a scenario to worry about? What would it look like? And really, is there much to be done about it? I mean, the Constitution does seem to say that state legislatures decide how electors are appointed. Where do things stand in terms of state and federal laws on that front now?
Well, I think it is something to worry about if it were to happen. And as Julia said, if we do end up with the two sets of electors from a state, it's very difficult to resolve. And one could imagine, going right back to the 1876 problems again. That being said, I don't want to be too optimistic, but I think that there are people who talked about that, and state legislatures who were encouraged to do that, and they didn't. And at some point, it is a very difficult thing to do. I don't want to say it's all bluster, but there's a certain amount of bluster that state legislatures were talking about. They were unhappy with the election. They wanted to express their disapproval of the result. But to actually say, we ran this election, it was pretty clear who won the popular vote, and we're just putting our stamp in the other direction. I think that's very, very difficult. A more, a closer case, I suppose, for people is, when we went back to the 2000 election, for example, a really, really close election where you could argue about every little detail that might move a few hundred votes in one direction. And if perhaps one side felt like, all of these other institutions, the courts and others were taking advantage and they were changing the law, there's this theory that state legislatures could step back in. As to what people could do about it, whether it's I think it's hard to do something about it, but Yuval is right that at the heart, if states wanted to not have elections, which I think they're not going to do, they could clearly appoint the electors. They could put themselves in the law, as some states are contemplating doing, that they would be kind of a final review board of the elections. I think that's probably constitutional and arguably, would be, some people wouldn't like it, but I think that's arguably constitutional. So I think it's a very, very difficult thing, but I think it's a bridge that is hard to go over. I mean, the court could perhaps rule that once you have an electoral system and you've given it over to running elections by state law, you can't step back in or not. I'm not sure the court would do that, and there might be some nuance in how a state might come back in. So I guess the long answer to your question is, I think it is very, very messy. I think there is a constitutional power that state legislatures have. It's arguably limited when you actually decide to have elections and have state laws, but how exactly it's limited, in what ways, I think that's very difficult to absolutely ascertain. And it's hard for Congress to really push down the state legislatures and say, you don't have any of that power, because some of it is there.
Julia, a thought on this question?
Yeah, I think so. I've been thinking about this in terms of all the things that I thought were beyond the possibility of this political system that have now happened. And that actually goes back to August of 2000, when I told one of my professors that I thought the Electoral College and the popular vote would split. I wish I had more witnesses to that conversation. And he told me he didn't think that would probably happen. So, I mean, at the time, that was seen as a pretty unlikely possibility, right? And then it did happen. And it happened after the Electoral College thing, after Bush v. Gore was sorted out with relatively little sort of protest and fanfare. I think there are two reasons for that. One is the election was truly close. And the other was that the primary was not especially competitive. And so Bush had a really consolidated party behind him. And I think some of what would matter in such a scenario, in terms of would people accept it if that happened, would be how close was the general election and how fractious was the party behind the candidate who did that. This is pure speculation, but I think it's useful to think about. And in terms of the likelihood of that scenario, I agree with John, it's very hard to imagine, but you do also have a situation in which, race comes up again, right? In which the kinds of states that are close are also states in which sometimes the state legislative apparatus is pretty hostile to the urban areas where a lot of the Democratic votes come from. And that affects the politics of the state. That's certainly the dynamic where I live. which was the closest kind of Trump Biden state, right? So I think that's sort of the scenario. I don't think it's likely, but I think the politics around it could go a lot of different ways if it did happen.
And I think everything that needs to be said has been said here. I would just simply add that the people making these decisions, the people deciding to do this, for instance, take the election of electors into their own hands. These people have to face election. They have to face re-election. So that would be a hard one to do. I mean, that would be tough. You'd have to go out and tell the voters why, even though it looked like candidate A got, 1,300 more votes than candidate B, you voted for candidate B. That's a tough one.
Elaine, a couple of the answers that the three of you have given to that question pointed to the courts too, and that's another subject that's come up in the audience questions in a few different ways, particularly on the question of legitimacy. If something were to go wrong in ways that are not clearly addressed by existing federal laws or in ways that we can look to, would the intervention of the courts in this moment strengthen the public sense of legitimacy of the system, or is that an even bigger nightmare than what we're already talking about?
It's funny you should ask that, Yuval, because I've just been talking to some potential authors today to write about this question of the Supreme Court, and is it falling prey to the same polarization that the rest of that everybody from Congress to school boards is falling prey to, and what would that do to the legitimacy of the court? Now, going back to 2000, when the court spoke, that was it. I was in the Gore campaign, and it was a sad day, but that was it. Okay, Al Gore said so. We all understood what we had to do. I don't know that Donald Trump would have done the same thing, right? I mean, he might have kept on fighting. I do remember going abroad after that for various U.S. government agencies, and how the diplomats, all of American diplomats after that, were they wanted people to come and talk about the 2000 election because they wanted to brag about America's ability to transfer power, even in an election that was so close and obviously possibly disputed. So we would lose something really big if the courts did not have, by the time that happened, the legitimacy to make a decision on an election and have that decision be accepted. So let's hope we don't get there.
John, on this question on the courts?
Yeah, I think it's a very complicated question because you referred to it in the plural, the courts. Well, there are federal courts and there are also state courts, and in Florida, for example, there was big dispute there, right? And gets back to some of our questions about, well, does state law prevail, or is there some sort of federal interest? I do think we were fortunate that certainly many Democrats didn't like the decision of Bush v. Gore, and probably the confidence in the court among Democrats went down some. They accepted it, and Al Gore accepted the decision. I can think of worse scenarios, though, and not just in terms of not accepting, but just in how directly the courts get involved. As much as Bush v. Gore did effectively end the counting, it was about some narrow issues and stopping the recount, which then effectively ended where we were. If we ask courts to address some of these questions we're all talking about, well, can Congress come in and overrule the states? Can the state legislatures come in? I mean, those are even more direct questions that both there's one question of whether the court should be involved at all, and secondly that they might take a political or take one side, which will be seen poorly. So I'm not sure courts are going to be the answer. I don't think our parties are going to just throw it to the courts and say, you decide. I mean, arguably many of our institutions are set for political institutions to decide. It's a very complicated electoral college because there are many of those institutions, but there's a kind of sense that the courts are not the ones to be involved. So again, I hope we don't get to that point, because I guess I see a worse set of scenarios than 2000 with respect to that.
Julia?
Yeah, I mean, the courts, so the question is about legitimacy. I think there's a decent chance by 2024 that there will be even, kind of deeper legitimacy problems with the court, at least for people who kind of lean left. The courts to me seem like they've been, on the one hand, fairly kind of cautious around. Certainly they were a kind of bulwark in the 2020 election, right? Very cautious in that regard, but also not especially invested in protecting voting rights. And that's been a persistent feature of the Roberts Court that, again, predates Trump. So, I think that a lot of these types of decisions could go either way. I also think that courts can be technical in the way that we're talking about in terms of the constitutionality of some of these things that states could do with slates of electors. Sometimes they're technical, sometimes they're not, right? Sometimes they're more differential to the sense of the true political stakes of the issue, or of the sort of common understanding of what an election is. I don't have a lot of confidence that that would be something that would come out of most of the courts that we now have, but it certainly has been part of that equation.
Well, we are coming toward the end of our time, and maybe as a way to close, I might ask each of you to think about what advice you'd offer to policymakers that is a mix of plausible and actually worthwhile about what to do on the question of election reform. Where should they devote their energy? What should they be trying to achieve, say, between now and the next presidential election? Elaine, where would you start if someone were to ask for your advice?
Well, I would start with Congress, and I think that there the answer is pretty simple, which is find out those pieces of both the election reform bills, the John Lewis bill and the other bill, find out those pieces that can pass, that Manchin agrees to, that Sinema agrees to, that you can pass, and just do it. And don't let the party, because the Democratic Party has been completely dysfunctional on this regard, don't let the party try to throw in the kitchen sink and therefore sink the whole thing, which is what they've managed to do with Build Back Better. Go ahead and get the pieces done that you can get. And then I think people have to concentrate at the local level. And there is a simple answer, which we never, ever come to, but I know Julia would come to. The answer is political parties, guys. Political parties are institutions. They exist from one election to another election, and they have an interest in the quality of the elections. They have an interest in turning out voters, et cetera. If we have equally matched political parties at the state and the local levels, then guess what? You've got a situation of competition, and you're going to keep the system pretty clean and pretty honest. But it really does have to fall to the patchwork of state and local political parties in America to watch the election machinery, to watch the way elections are administered, because they're the ones that have the ongoing stake in that system.
Julia, how would you offer advice?
So I don't have a lot of nuts and bolts advice, but I think the way I've been thinking about it is to kind of balance between the folk wisdom about why people distrust these institutions and the kind of verifiable reality, and figure out where is the overlap there between what are things that are really happening and what are the reasons that people are losing confidence, and how can you address things that fall into that sort of Venn diagram of considerations.
John?
Well, look, on Elaine's point, I guess I want to disagree a little bit, that I think that the Democrats probably aren't going to come together and find just what Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema are going to get and pass something through, unless you persuade them that it's so important that they have to get rid of the filibuster. That seems to be the sticking point here. And so I actually do think that we could do some things at the federal level. I look at the 2000 election in some ways as a model where we spent some time, not a few months, but almost a year plus, and we got a compromise bill not everybody was happy with, but we actually did a fair amount. We had the first time funding. So I think going back to the drawing board and finding some compromise that would get past the 60 vote threshold is something that could be done. Now, the parties are far apart, but I think there are things like voting technology, which both parties have some reasons to maybe want to up the standards for, perhaps some funding, voter registration. The Electoral Count Act, I think, is a separate thing that they should work on, and absolutely, I think could get done. But I think also these things might be done at the state level. And again, I put all those things forward. The last thing I'll note, and I know this is an interest of Yuval's as well, is just we don't think enough about how we count votes after the election, how to do it efficiently and how to do it quickly and transparently. It wouldn't get rid of all conspiracy theorists, but I think it would be a good thing to focus on. And really, after the 2000 election, you would think many states would have focused on that because the election recounts were such at the forefront. But here, I think each state in its own way could really look and say, well, how are we getting this done? And can we get it done in a way that would be better and inspire more confidence and hopefully be more, more speedy as well? I think that's the sort of set of projects that we could work on at the state level.
Well, we will have to end there. Let me just say, first of all, to the three of you, thank you very much for a fantastic conversation, informative and thoughtful and engaging in just the right way. And on behalf of the Library of Congress and the American Enterprise Institute at the Brookings Institution, let me also thank all of you in the audience for joining us and for some excellent questions. This is a continuing series, as we hope you know. The next of these discussions will take up the state of the U.S. military from an institutional point of view. And again, the question of public trust. That'll be on February 17th in the afternoon, and you'll be able to find more information about that soon. This conversation, like all the past ones, will also be posted on YouTube shortly. And again, thank you all for joining us. Have a very good evening.